We're going to move quickly now to our next panel. Really excited about this one, just as I was for the first one. Really grateful that Jason Swan, one of our NoCo members, is here with us today. He's with Western Resource Advocates and is going to be moderating a panel with Taylor Ruffin with Environmental Learning for Kids, Jesus Castro with Conservation Colorado, and Topher Downham with City of Boulder Open Space and Mountain Parks. And I'm going to just turn it promptly over to Jason. Again, Jonathan had sent you all bios if you want to read a little more, but we'll get to know folks, I think, pretty quickly through this panel. So Jason, it's all yours.
Good morning, everyone. Sometimes you just got to take a deep breath, and get ready to jump into another discussion. So I just want to welcome everyone, all our NoCo participants, all our distinguished guests. I really appreciate you taking on this discussion. I am pretty honored to lead this discussion today on the barriers to access and inclusion. A lot of the things that we've talked about already have been echoed, may actually be echoed in this conversation as well. So feel free to ask questions. I really would like to see some of that so we can, I can hand it over to some of our panelists. And like the last discussion, I'm going to just set some intentions and then we can jump into the discussion. A change is necessary so that every person can be awakened to the inequalities of our systems and to unplug ourselves out of the matrix so that everyone has a meaningful involvement both in the design of services and the ability to participate in public policy dialogue. Everyone, especially those who have been disproportionately affected by the rules, have the right to be well and seen as a whole person. We can no longer ignore or minimize the very real and potentially tragic harms associated with some behaviors and actions. I do want to pose the first question, and then we can open it up to the rest of the panelists, to Jesus. My first question to you is, how do broader social justice concerns, for example, poverty, economic and racial injustice, inform how or why underrepresented communities use public lands?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. And I think the way we'll answer these questions, I think we're going to unprecedented times right now with 2020. It's just been a crazy year for many reasons, and we have seen a lot of discriminations against people of color in daily basis, microaggressions with the police, like just all over the country, with just like some of our legislators being openly talking bad about people of color, about things that we are not really like that, just putting like really offensive things out there. And just like for me, going to the store, I get scared that someone might look at me different because of the color of my skin or because I am a gay man, and that's really stressful. So for me to go camping on my own, or going just or trying to go to like hiking by myself, I get really scared because I feel like there's no one around it that can protect me, and that's like a really scary thought. Um, like when I was little, my dad used to take me to our neighbor state in Mexico, Chihuahua, and he used to take me to the mountains. And it was something like that we both did, and it was a really an amazing experience just growing up because we never got along, and that was just like a way for us to like actually have something in common that we like. Um, but here I'm afraid to go hiking. I'm afraid to do any of these things because I've always feel like people are looking at me. If I'm listening to music in Spanish, I feel like people are like, if it's too loud, people might get upset. So I'm always trying to act perfect. And I have friends that also experience discrimination just going camping. People, they're being harassed and they had to leave these areas. So many of us don't feel comfortable like within our own cities, but and when we go in these places, it gets even worse. We get more we are more scared. We don't feel comfortable being ourselves or being allowed to use these spaces.
Thank you so much for that. You know, that resonates with me a lot, to be honest. You know, I certainly have felt that same fear. So you are not alone in that. One of the reasons why I bring a lot of people with me to hiking, you know, just that barrier of safety, I feel like, you know, it's funny for people of color having to plan out, you know, where you go and what places are safe for you to partake in. So I certainly understand that. Toffer, would you like to chime in?
Yeah, with disabilities, it's kind of interesting as far as that there's a similar fear, but it's a little bit different. I'm not really afraid that I'm going to get beat up when I'm out camping by myself or going on a trail, but I'm always worried about what's the access going to be like. Am I going to be able to find a disabled spot? Is there going to be somebody that's not disabled using that spot? Is there going to be like a washout? Am I going to be able to get actually to the trail? Are there bathrooms? Just a lot of those worries. And I mean, even when you're out hiking, you're worried, am I going to like end up getting back to my car and somebody's going to be parked in the hashtags next to the disabled spot? Am I going to get back in? It's funny, like what Jesus was saying too. It's like, it's great to have allies. And I'm going to bring this up a lot during our conversations, but having people around that are aware of people that there's people with different differences that are underrepresented, that they understand them and can help us out if we're in a bind. It's easy for me to do. I can just kind of grab anybody and be like, hey, my car is being blocked by this motorcycle. Can you back up my car for me? Then I can get in, and or can you get me through this like washout area so I can get to the trail? Yeah, not always the same for different underrepresented populations. But yeah, that would definitely be the biggest part for me.
You know, it's interesting because I'm hearing, or at least what I'm hearing is, you know, these barriers or can be preventing a lot of people, not just you, from actually utilizing the public lands and taking advantage of it. And so that's certainly something I'm hearing. How about you, Taylor? I'm really curious about your perspective as well.
Personally, as like a cisgendered white passing male, my experience in the outdoors is pretty much very simple, also very able-bodied. So my experience comes from taking other people out. So my understanding, I take a lot of youth outdoors, youth and families. The community we work with is the northeastern community, so I try and take these considerations when we do go into these spaces, like the social and cultural feel, like the sense of belonging that Jesus brought up. Like, are we going to go into a space where youth and families feel comfortable, especially when it comes to, you know, other participants, other recreators, or even law enforcement. Sometimes we do a lot of service projects in parks, national and state parks. Participants will kind of think we are, you know, a juvenile detention group. Like, we get a lot of those engagements where people are like, oh, you know, who do you work with? What did you do? And I was like, well, what did we do? I mean, we're here to help, you know, steward and preserve and those kinds of things. So those are some of the interactions I've had. So like knowing that people are treated differently because of their differences exists. And I think identifying that and understanding differences can be a challenge and a barrier, but for land managers, it's kind of how can we leverage those differences, identify them and value them so that it changes the work that we do. So making sure that people do feel comfortable, both like the sense of safety, sense of belonging, as well as, you know, like access and all those things. So for me, I try to take those things into consideration so that the people that I take out don't have to think about it, so that their connection to the outdoors is a positive one that makes them want to keep coming back. So ultimately, I try and foster relationships with the outdoors, especially when it comes to education. So a lot of things that Parker and the panelists said previous is how we talk about narratives and that people in the outdoors don't always recreate the same. So trying to take the folks that I take out, kind of understand that this is an outdoor spaces for everyone, but recreation isn't. I forget who mentioned that. I made that note that recreation isn't for everyone, but the outdoors are, and the connections that you make are unique, and you don't have to have somebody else dictate how you interact in the outdoors. I think that's where I like to come from. So I think that's where I'll end that there. But those barriers of belonging, comfort, knowledge, safety are big in how I do the work that I do when we go into these spaces.
Belonging, safety, comfort, knowledge, all the things that are necessary. And some of the barriers, I think, to get BIPOC people out in the outdoors as well. I think, I read an article that that was one of the resources that was sent out from NoCoPLACES, and it talked about the top two things that really prevented people from going out, which was, education, the know-how, not understanding public lands, and then obviously, I think it was also the transportation to get there. And that was just eye-opening for me as well. And I'm curious, I want to stick here just for a little bit longer because I want to understand, Taffer, specifically you, how you would approach getting to a public space. What process do you go down being a quadriplegic?
So I have my own vehicle, and I use that most of the time. I know a lot of people with disabilities don't have their own vehicles and have to go through like Via or Access-a-Ride or take a bus. And so that's another possibility for a barrier. But yeah, when I approach it, I try to do some research online first and see what the accessibility is. We basically, my agency, we put together a guidebook with all the accessible trails so people can look ahead of time, and see if this is something they want to do. But that doesn't always mean that those conditions are going to be the same. There could be a rain that wipes things out. So you kind of have to, I approach things like it may be completely different from what I read. I kind of approach things like I'm pleasantly surprised when everything's super accessible. I went to Craters of the Moon in Idaho recently, and had no idea how accessible it was going to be, but it was amazing. And yeah, that just made my day. So I kind of look at it like with skepticism, I guess, when I'm approaching something as far as accessibility, because so many times you're told that something's going to be accessible and it isn't.
I'm going to move on to the next question. I read each one of your bios, and I'm gonna stick with you, Taffer. Much like yourself, the mountains bring me peace and healing too. It is a place of solace. I think for all of us, in some shape, form, or fashion, that's exactly what it gives us. So whenever I'm out there, she reminds me of who has control, right? And I use nature. It's a she in my eyes. So it always reminds me who has control. It's not me, it's not you, it's not any politician, man or woman, but Mama Nature. And she decides when and where the wind blows, the sun rises, and the night falls for me. So, which brings me to my next question. What are the issues and barriers encountered by, Black, Indigenous, people of color, people with disabilities and other groups when it comes to their use and value for public lands? Some of the things that were echoed before was things such as, the naming of public lands and access, the connection to the identity and self-care that I even heard some, Taylor, I think you even mentioned. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
The biggest barrier is, I think, just lack of understanding. And meetings like this where people are listening and trying to understand are the best way to kind of get past all this. One of the things that I've been doing to help with this whole lack of understanding and creating allies is we take people on wheelchair hikes. So we throw just regular tabbies, we call them, temporarily able-bodied people. We take them on the hike so they get a better understanding of like what the barriers are, what a cross slope is, what the 8% grade is, what a 1% grade is. Just how like a little rock will slow you down. We also have started taking people on all-terrain hand cycle rides. Like I take out trail builders on these bike rides with these, they're these hand cycles with like a pretty wide front wheelbase and one wheel in the back, power assist, so they're a other powered mobility device. And we take them out on the trails so they get a better understanding of, oh, yeah, the gates need to be bigger. This trail, this turning radius needs to be bigger. Oh, all these rocks that are in the way, we need to get rid of some of those. They call these things gargoyles that they put on mountain bike trails. And if they make those too narrow, then these bikes can't get by. So just having people basically experience things and create some empathy is one of the best things to get rid of these barriers.
I really love that, letting people get a firsthand experience. And I think even for myself, I'm like, sign me up. I want to certainly be able to at least, look through the lens of someone else's experiences. So I can be able to create more empathy, really what it comes down to.
Yeah, I invite all of you, if you want to come sometime, Jason, or anybody that's in this meeting, if you want to come out for a bike ride or a wheelchair hike, let me know.
Thank you. Hey, Jesus, I want to be able to point that question to you as well.
I think I can give you like my experience as an immigrant. I moved to this country 20 years ago, and hiking was like such a foreign thing for me, or like just being outdoors, because where I come from, it's flat. There's nothing. So if I wanted to go somewhere, like I said, like me and my dad had to travel to a different state to see the mountains, to be in the mountains, and it was a touristic place. So when I moved here and I realized that we had the access to these places, it was really coming to people just to go to the mountains, just to like be outdoor. I was like, oh my gosh, like American people are crazy. Like for me, it was like so hard to understand at first. I was like, this is so weird. They just pay like, like some cash, and they just park, and then they go and have an adventure. It was, I couldn't understand. I couldn't understand it at first, and it took some years for me to enjoy that, to see like, oh, this is normal. I'm from Fort Collins, so I have the Horsetooth Reservoir just like 20 minutes away from where I live. So there's like a lot of places for hiking, for swimming, and I take advantage of that. But I think for a lot of immigrants, we come from places that a lot of them, well, they don't speak the language yet. We have a lot of people coming in the last few years seeking for refuge, and they might not know about that they have access to these spaces. And also in a lot of our countries, going hiking, it's more of it's like a rich people thing. It's not common. So I think a lot of people in the immigrant community, or even like first generation, like my younger sister, it's like a foreign thing to do. And I think at some point, it's been such a weird year, but at some point I would like to, once when COVID passes, or whatever happens this year, like it will be nice to like sort of like have a program where we do like a hike with folks of the immigrant community and show them around. Like, I think that will be such a cool experience, but that will take a lot of work, and it's not the right time right now. But it's something that I would like to keep in mind, or if anyone wants to do it at some point, I think that will be such an amazing experience.
Yeah, it would be. I've had discussions, being the outdoor effort leader here of Colorado as well, the opportunity to engage in conversations with the city of Aurora and other folks to talk about how can we get, immigrants and refugees more involved with our public lands and things as such. So that is something that is near and dear to my heart. So I'm glad you brought that up. Taylor, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, so talking about creating empathy and shared understanding, I think that's a really good place to start for land managers, policymakers to, see the world through the eyes of the individuals that they represent, connect with those people so that they can provide that representation. For one, I think healing from trauma. So the previous panel discussion talked a lot about the narrative around public lands and these places. And we say that they're for everyone, but there's still this historical traumatic healing that is a barrier for people. And that's passed from generation to generation. It's like, I come from a mixed racial background. So my experience is pretty unique, where my dad's family sees the outdoors one way, my mother's family sees the outdoors the other way. I'm taught both experiences, and like seeing it and trying to live it and understand it, like, oh, this place isn't safe. That is something that has been taught. You shouldn't go to this place because it's not safe for you. It's been something that's ingrained because of the traumatic experience. So I think for land managers, policymakers, understanding that trauma still needs to be healed. I think the current state, a lot of the social justice movements happening now can attest that healing is still happening, and it's an ongoing process. And that investment is something that even in the outdoor space is something we need to address for all identity groups, all marginalized identity groups. Is important. So I think that's one thing I would want to touch on, and sharing in the healing too, because if you carry that around, so like you have like Black History Month, so like how Black history is separate from American history, and so people from the Black community have to carry that burden of that trauma with them every day. It's kind of a challenge when we can address it as American history, and plug in any group, any marginalized or oppressed group into that analogy, and we can kind of work together to share in that healing of trauma. In the end, use the outdoor space as a vessel. I think at Elk, we do that quite a bit, that the outdoor space is a place where we can kind of shed those things so that we can be more vulnerable and share experiences and partake in that healing. So that's one thing I wanted to touch on, is that the healing is still needing to happen.
So much healing needs to happen. I preach that so much as well, is literally we need to understand our part that we play in the systems, and how the system has inherently contributed to our communities, rather good or bad. And we really need to figure out our own understanding of self before we can actually, interact, I think, with other groups. So I really appreciate that. That was great. I'm gonna stick with you, Taylor. Because that leads right into the next question. Working with Rising Routes, we wanted to contribute to a shift in the U.S. away from prejudice, injustice, inequities, while also contributing to implement a system in which the seats and experience of power, privilege, and human respect are shared between all races, gender identity, and intersectionality. Before we can change the system, people have to care to do it. So how would you characterize the day-to-day and underlying systemic challenges that are faced by groups that you work with and represent?
That question is just like, boom. I think it's a shared experience. I think everyone taking that little bit, everyone can kind of do their part and start where you're, most comfortable, I guess, and then kind of challenge by choice, start stepping out, getting uncomfortable, learning those things. The groups that can you ask the question one more time? I'm trying to wrap my head around it.
Yeah. How would you characterize the day-to-day underlying systemic challenges that the people that you work with and the groups that you take out, you represent? What would be some of those systemic issues that you're seeing that they have?
Yeah, systemic issues. I guess would start with, I work with high school, college students, and I do a summer employment program. And so we were talking about workforce development and representation in the workforces of public land agencies. And I think systemic issues would be hiring practices would be one, kind of especially with federal government, kind of one, it's really challenging to enter the workforce for a federal land management agency. The barrier to getting there, it's a commitment. I mean, working as a temp, as a seasonal for multiple seasons, just so that you could have the opportunity, not guaranteed, to get that full-time position. So I think that's one systemic component, is trying to address how we recruit and retain those individuals that we want to provide representation with, and why we do that. are we doing that for access and legitimacy? Like, are we just hiring this group, like this person from this group, so that we check that box, or are we just trying to, check that box? I think there's an aspect of depth sometimes when it comes to hiring practices, because I work with youth and I bring them into this space, and the biggest challenge is experiencing microaggressions in those professional settings and preparing students for that. So a lot of times we'll go to, a place where we have agency leadership, and they'll kind of articulate their perspective of elk and the students, and you can definitely tell that their mind is shifted, or they'll say or do certain things only because we come from a certain group. And I don't want to like say specific things, but really is the challenge is the hiring practices, like the undergraduate degree requirement for a lot of things. I know it's important to get your education, but when you're trying to engage people to work with your organization, I work with 15, 16, 17-year-olds are still in high school, and I value their time. I think Elk has a unique position because we can hire and pay people to do that work, to get that meaningful experience and see what land managers do, or other people in land management. Like, you don't have to be a biologist or a forester. You could work in real estate, an accountant, and trying to show that multitude of career opportunities. But hiring those people at the end of the day, if I have someone who has graduated, who has that undergraduate degree and is still competing, it's a challenge, because it's like we have an experienced individual who brings a unique perspective, but they didn't get the position. And why is that? Why didn't they get it? Not due to like, what is it, like merit? Like, I get that, you got to hire the best person for that job, but sometimes it is like a fit, that unconscious bias of someone hiring someone like them, and that comfort to where it's like, you sit down at the interview table and you see someone that doesn't look like you or doesn't look like your department. I think that's another thing. Like, you have a group of people where it's like, do they fit into our culture? It's like, well, maybe there's some roots, there's some biases of that culture. So for me, the biggest barrier would be hiring, workplace practices.
And I've heard this saying before, where although we may want to work in those spaces, it may be a good place to work. They may have a good mission, but it may not be a good place to work. You see what I'm saying? And to bring a person of color into these places, and they don't already have the tools equipped to make sure that it's welcoming, it's safe, and it feels like you can succeed. And I think that's also a barrier, in my opinion. Anyone else want to chime in on that?
Yes, I think for me, when I started with, at my with my job, I started with this program that reaches out to the Latinx community, and we talk about different climate issues. We want to have this community that that it's being impacted by all these different issues, environmental issues, but no one's put it in consideration what they think or how they can be helped. And I was so excited, I can't believe there's like a program like this. But also these are spaces that are normally, there's like more traditional environmentalists, that people of color, it's like, we're being impacted by all of these things, but we are not part of this conversation. So when I started doing my job, it was so hard, because a lot of people from the Latinx community, they're like, oh, you do this, like, what does this means, or like, why are you doing this job? And and then I started questioning myself, like, why am I doing this job? And I mean, it's important to my community, it's important to have representation. Like, sometimes for me, I started noticing when I talk to people in my community, they want to talk to me because I speak their language, because I looked at them, and that's important. Because sometimes, with everything that is happening, we're too afraid to share our stories, to have a conversation with someone else. And I have the ability to speak two languages, to have different identities. And that has really helped my work, and I'm good at what I do. But besides all of that, but it is a little hard for me to talk to my community. It's been really hard, especially this last few months. I've been struggling with the thought is like, how do I ask them to sign a petition when they are struggling with COVID? How do I ask them to come to a hearing or do specific things when they might not be familiarized with the technology, with even Zoom? So I I think sometimes working with, like, in my case, it's as an organizer, it's yes, organizing, helping like guide people, like, this is what we're doing, like, you like, this is the way that but it's also an educational aspect too. So like, I'm not only like organizing, I'm also trying to support them and guide them and show them the way things work in politics, or the way, like, like, just like something as simple how a bill becomes a law. And there's specific language that sometimes they don't understand. So like, as a organizer of color, my job gets really heavy because I do more than I'm supposed to, and it could be it's really stressful sometimes.
I can probably resonate, and not necessarily resonate, but I hear you. I feel like in that field, you may also have the role of a social worker in a way as well, and so you're doing a lot of work there. And I think one thing you mentioned was just this type of trust. I know I have a friend that is working on this trust ecology, and one of the things that you mentioned was this affinity-based trust that from personal experiences, from your language, people are going to automatically trust you, right? To a certain degree. And then you have that dispositional trust, where it's the lack of trust people have before you even come into the room, and so it's really a dynamic when you start looking at the sphere of trust. And I think one of the things you had mentioned, and I think it was echoed by Parker earlier, was just that that hierarchy of needs. There's things that have to be taken care of before you can get to that self-actualization. So yeah, a lot of work to be done. How about you, Troffer? You got any insight?
Yeah, I really appreciate what Taylor and Jesus were saying. I think it does start with hiring and getting people that are underrepresented within the organization and involved. Because a lot of times, I think a lot of stuff, instead of being addressed right from the beginning, becomes and an add-on. And I think everything needs to be like thought of right from the get-go and just built into our systems, because it doesn't turn out as well when you're like adding it on later. Yeah, and the whole idea of we a lot of times think like so if it's just a bunch of middle-aged white guys or young white guys, like, say, building trails, like, they don't think about everything else. That's just what they're caught in, is who they are. So you get like I lead these programs where I'm taking out retirement communities, and every single time I'm taking them out on a hike, I'll get the question, why don't you guys have more benches? And it's just something like I don't think about, because I bring my bench with me all the time in my wheelchair. And young people don't think about that either. Like, they don't realize that there's some people that can't sit down on the ground and get back up. So it's just always like trying to have that forethought and including people in those discussions at the beginning before you're like, oh crap, we messed up again. Yeah.
I love that. And, I'm so happy when I'm on the trail and I see a bench. So I don't know about anybody else, but so Adrienne Maree Brown, she's the author of The Pleasure Activism. I was just reading her book just recently. I would definitely encourage everybody to take a look at it. It's really good. But she quoted, she said, deep political, and this kind of goes back to what we were just discussing. She said, deep political alignment with people who want to collaborate had taught her more than years of battling with people who wanted to dominate her or compete against her. So the question is, have you encountered any concerns or questions about budget or staffing capacity of organizations to make DEI improvements? work processes. You know, we were just talking about how that needs to be at the forefront of this discussion and not at the end. And, you know, I see that in a lot of places. So it's just like, we should lead with DEI and not let it be the last thing we have a discussion about. So we'd love to hear, and I can, you know, say that question again. Have you encountered any questions, concerns about the budget or staffing capacity of organizations to make, or in your own organization, to make DEI improvements to work processes?
I think I also work for a nonprofit, and I do a lot of work with immigrant nonprofits in Fort Collins, and you know, like, I think everyone's struggling with budgeting, every nonprofit, and it's you know, it's been like a weird year because it's also election year. We're so close to elections, so it's been just interesting. But from my organizations, it's been important to keep having these conversations. Everyone that I've been working with, including Conservation Colorado, we had the funding, or we had, like, before the crisis started, having like equity training or have these conversations. Like, it has been really, and the ones in Fort Collins, they look for the funding to have these conversations, because more than ever, talking about diversity and inclusion, it's more important than it has never been before. So I've been lucky in that way, and I think, like, with the people that I work, it's such an important conversation. But that's my experience. I got really lucky. But I don't know, you know, like, I know, like, other of my friends, they struggle with, like, trainings or even having interpretation for events. So I think it goes from organization to organization.
I almost want to ask, if it's not too much, you know, because I always look at the, you know, people can be beholden to funders, right? And the funders don't necessarily have or as in tune with, you know, DEI efforts and things as such, you know, they're not going to put their money towards it. And as you mentioned, because of all what's been happening this year, it's been a major shift, I think, for some, not all, foundations to put more money, you know, outside of, you know, maybe big conservation organs start really, you know, putting money towards some of our communities and such. So I'm seeing a little shift in that, and if anybody can speak to that, that would be great. But Taylor, do you have your thoughts? Okay.
I got it now. Yeah, I apologize for that. But I think a lot of times it's an excuse that, like, it's just, we don't want to put in that work because it's so challenging. And that's what I was trying to get at. So at Elk, it's our cornerstone. So we value it, the time and the money that goes into this. So organizations that need to value the time that it takes to do this work, both interpersonally and organizationally, so that it's an investment, both in time and money and education. And I think that undertaking, they feel takes away from the work. And there isn't much to point at the success of it, unfortunately. You know, I feel a diversity of, like, a cognitive diversity. It creates more creative solutions. I think once people see the value in that, I think then they'll start to have more willingness to provide that budgeting. So I think COVID makes things challenging, but even pre-COVID, we had a lot of things, like, folks will want Elk staff to come and provide a diversity, equity, and inclusion training for free, you know, or like, come in and talk with us. And so I think organizations have to kind of put their money where their mouth is when it comes to this. Not just with money. I mean, that's important for the people that do the work, but also the time as well. Like what you were saying, like an hour just to talk about DEI is not enough. So that continued investment is important as well, especially with accommodations as well. So in that workplace, the workforce, if you have a person of difference that needs a certain accommodation, are you providing that in an equitable way too? I think sometimes it's just an excuse. I think it's kind of simple in that way, where you just don't want it because it's uncomfortable. So experiencing that discomfort and valuing that difference is where it begins.
One of the things that we did as an organization, and we're fortunate, one of our master planners has a daughter with a disability, so understands this. And during the whole master plan creation, he thought a lot about inclusion for all underrepresented communities. So in our master plan, inclusion is basically a tier 1 priority, and that's like the top tier of like 4 or 5 different priorities. So that helps direct our budget and everything. And it's basically saying, yeah, like inclusion is right there on the top. This is something that we can't just discard because we don't have enough money. We've got to make sure and incorporate teams. Like we have a JEDI team now, DEI, but with a J. So it's justice, equality, diversity, inclusion. Sounds more Star Wars-ish. But we have a team that's just basically a bunch of our workers trying to make things better for all underrepresented communities. And we also have an accessibility team. So we're looking at things, the whole scope of accessibility too. And I feel like those kind of teams within an organization kind of help keep the budget on track and keep the mission on track.
You know, one of the things you mentioned was that someone, you said your manager or your boss had someone, his daughter, you say? Was
Yeah.
So that's where, you know, how do you get people to care? Well, people, sometimes in this case, where people care is when someone that they love is directly affected by some of those issues. And it just changes the whole, the whole outlook. You know, you were blind before, and then someone you love is affected by the same issues. You're like, oh, I get it now for some reason. But I really appreciate you sharing that. There is a question in the chat box, so I want to make sure I address it. Can you address specific actions outdoor organizations and land management agencies can take to improve hiring practices or other efforts to attract diverse staff?
I think it's preparing your organization to receive those individuals, whoever they are, whatever group they belong to, so that they feel welcome. I think that's another thing I was touching before about budgeting. And so our objectives are always like, we need to increase our diversity by 10%. Like, what does that really mean? I think a lot of the objectives surrounding equity and inclusion are quantitative when they should be qualitative. So I think that's where your hiring practices need to be more holistic and identifying the quality behind your hiring practices. There isn't necessarily that silver bullet, like you need to do this. I think shifting your brain to quality engagement versus targeting as well. Like, oh, we need to work with Elk because they represent a huge Latino community, and that's who we need to get on this hiring pool. So I think to start, where you should start is like, is your organization ready to undergo the things that need to change? Is there a shared mission and vision in leadership and across the organization? And then are you committed to that continuous journey of trying to make it happen? I think when you say, what's the action item, means that it's something you do and then it's done. I think it's challenging that non-closure component where we need to continue to do this forever. Like, it's never going to end. And I think that is accepting that. And so once your organization is ready and you get that diverse talent pool, like, I think they will stay too, because then there's that retention piece, because you can hire people of difference all day, but are they going to stay? And do they feel valued, or are you allowing them to make the changes that need to happen? I think that's another thing too. When you do have those individuals that are giving you recommendations for your organization, take those recommendations and do them, versus saying like, teach me about racism, teach me about oppression, but don't, challenge my beliefs. Don't make me feel uncomfortable. Don't make me have to change too much. I think that's another piece. So it's more qualitative than quantitative. I don't think there's anything you can point at and say, do this. It's more of the work individually and organizationally. And I think that's why it takes time and money. I hope that makes sense.
Made great sense to me. Anybody else want to chime in on that?
I think something really good that we do at my organization is that we have like a BLM Caucus, so like we meet like all the staff, that are the staff of color. We meet like once a month, and we're creating this like booklet of like policies that we would like to see, or like how to protect, or like if we have an issue attending a meeting or on a one-on-one, how can we protect ourselves? So we talk about these things, how to make our work not only like inside the institution, like a positive place, a place where we feel comfortable, but also with the outside, with our allies, with the other organizations. And we also, I know we're in the process of doing an LGBTQ plus caucus as well. And I think that's really important too, that our employers know that we need these spaces and we need to have these conversations, because our experiences are different from the other staff. We go through some, like I can give you an example. We use like a phone banking app, and I am always like, hi, I'm Jesus with Conservation Colorado, and I have got called names because my name is Jesus. As soon as people see my name, they know that I'm Latino, and they make jokes or things like that, and it now I'm like, I'm not okay with that, but I know how to handle it. And at first, it will really hurt me. Like, I will be for a couple of days like in a lot of pain. But because that we had this place, this like conversations like once a month, and I can bring this up, and they're like, "Oh, that happened to me. Let's talk about it. Don't feel like this. It's important." And like I said, I just been really lucky. I know not all places are like that. I worked at places before where there was some harassment, and I will talk to management, and they're like, that's your problem. And so I think I got really lucky, and I'm happy to be where I am. But unfortunately, not all places see it like that. Some places might be like, let's elevate these voices, let's um help them feel part of this, and there's other places it's like, that's your problem, you deal with that on the side. I don't want any of that drama. It's not drama, it's our daily lives.
Jesus, you are saying a lot that resonates with me. I worked in finance for a very long time, 8 years to be exact. And I can remember my first time actually having to talk to a client or even seeing them face to face. Rather, I saw them face to face or over the phone. My first was imposter syndrome is what it is basically, is you have this fear of that you're not supposed to be in this space, or you're not supposed to be doing this or doing that. And I had to quickly get over that. But I do remember, similar to you, when I talk, I'm from the South, and I would be country a little bit. And some people will notice that, and they will say something about it. And then they'll ask me, not all the time, but some people are brave enough to ask me what my nationality is and things like that. And when I meet people first face to face, I felt a inferiority type of complex when I would have to talk to millionaires and have conversations with them, because they see a Black man, and I'm like, oh, I hope they don't judge me. I hope they don't think I don't know what I don't know, or whatever. And so I totally get that. So that's a conversation that needs to be to continue to discuss, and in a group setting where it's brave enough that we can actually have that conversation. I do want to bring up this last question before we end. Due to the biases we see, and Toffer, I'm sorry, I want to make sure we ask this. Due to the biases we see in our institutions, especially by those who hold the most power, specifically in our education system, do you believe implementing diversity, equity, and inclusion training on a micro level is the best way to make change, requiring all new hires or volunteers to participate in an accepted diversity curriculum? Kind of like a mini social work training course.
But I think it's something that you have to continue on. How do I say this? It can't end with the training. There's got to be ways to make sure that training is checked into, or and I can't come up with the right words, but it can't just disappear after the training. I mean, we all go to trainings and we learn something, and then a month later we've forgotten what it's all about. Like in a couple of weeks, I'll forget about this meeting and I'll have another one. But yeah, it's something that we have to make sure is ingrained into our memories and is checked up on along the way, like some practice things, so that it doesn't disappear.
Anyone else want to take on that? We still have some time.
it's complicated.
We still have time for a last thought, I suppose.
Yeah, I think Toffer said it's complicated. So addressing the complexity and holding multiple spaces for multiple groups of people, I think a lot of times a DEI conversation can skew one way or another. And it's hard for people to hold space for all oppressed groups and try and like take it all on. So I think diving into that complexity and spending the time that it takes to, learn something that isn't your own experience is a great place for folks to start.
Well, we are almost at time. I'll give you one, probably like 30 seconds back of your day. And you can do whatever you want with that. I want to just thank all of you for taking the time to engage in this conversation. It's much appreciated. I always enjoy hearing different perspectives and experiences. So I really appreciate that, and you.